Right, so my research in the past half year or so have been looking into lifted planning. So what I came across, if you look at like from domains with like many different objects, you might reach a like one of these problems where grounding is simply infeasible due to memory, or it might even take like a long time just to get grounding in the first place. So we from the Netherlands have like loads of bikes. If you like a domain like this with like tons of objects, like many planets would just fail in the grounding stage alone. And one of the main staple, like many grounding, many planning techniques rely on this grounding. Be it like computing heuristics, like getting landmark information, doing abstractions. If you get a problem like this, you just fail. Oh, sorry, guys. So sometimes like the problem itself might not be hard to solve, but might just be really big. And with the current technologies we have nowadays, we just like that in the water. So we look at like how can we get like good risk information by lifting and not like die in the grounding process. So for example, if you got a drive log domain with like many trucks, drivers, and packages to deliver, if you want to ground this, just the actions need to represent in memory is going to take like 18 gigabytes alone, which for most systems is like way too much. Whereas like the problem itself is easy to solve. If you don't want to do it optimally, it's quite easy. It's like one truck, one drive, just drive around and lift every package individually, you're done. Like we as humans can do this, but it presents you a planner and you fail. So what we've been looking at using the FF heuristic, but in a lifted fashion, so we don't use as much memory. We're trying to look at like, can we create like a lifted FF heuristic, but still get like good heuristic guidance. So the first thing we looked at is creating the lex plane graph. So this is like a lex plane graph, like a simple drive log domain. And the lex plan is like in the bottom as FF would like created. So from this lex graph, we would like extract the lex plan and use it for heuristic guidance. But if you like look at this particular domain, you see there's like a lot of repetition in the lex plan. So for example, like truck 1 and truck 2 start at the same location. So every action applicable to one truck will be applicable to the other truck. And there's like a lot of overlap by doing the same thing for two objects which are like pretty much symmetrical in this case. Furthermore, for these two drivers, like once driver 1 reaches initial location driver 2 and vice versa, you can predict that like all the predicates which can be reachable for one of the drivers will be reachable for the other driver. So once you reach like one of the fact layers where both are like reached each other's initial states, from that point on, the same actions will be introduced for every individual driver. And by basically combining them and making them equivalent, we can reduce this overhead and save loads of memory. So given like any problem instance, we're looking for these equivalent objects. And by treating them equivalently, we basically lift these objects and treat them as sets of objects, instead of like, trying to treat them individually. So during the construction of this lex plane graph, we try to look for these equivalent objects. And we say two objects are equivalent if both of them can reach each other's initial state. So what we're trying to get by this is a shorter, relaxed plan, because we can actually treat objects as sets of objects equivalent. And furthermore, we can actually prove facts to be true for objects without actually having to like insert action to actually make that fact true for that individual object. And we'll show like examples of this like later on. Where, for example, if you've got two trucks, like 1 and truck 2, and you prove them to be equivalent, if like a fact is true for one of them, say like at truck 1, S1 is true for, is reachable for truck 1, we know the same holds for truck 2 without having like an explicit operator actually make this fact true. And by using this technique, we actually produce the same output as in the grounded case of the lex planning graph. So by doing this, we can generate the same outputs quicker and more memory efficient. So going back to the first example, we'll show how this works in practice. So looking at like both trucks, we see they start initial state, so their equivalent and treat them as equivalent. So we've got like a set of objects consisting of truck 1 and truck 2. And we record for them like the initial states and all these states, all effects which are reachable with the latest relaxation constraints. For both drivers, also haven't reached each other's initial states, so that we treat them separately. So as with like the grounded case, we start building up the relaxed planning graph. So in this case, we're going to move like the drivers like to S2 and P12 and S1, and we reach this relation like this state. So now we see that like both drivers have reached each other initial location, and from this point on we can treat them equivalently. Also know that in this case driver 2 reached location S2, whereas driver 1 has not. But when we make them equivalent, we know that like eventually driver 1 will reach this state. So when we make them like equivalent in this case, we treat them as like a set of objects, and now we see driver 1 has reached location S2 without us having to like introduce an action to make this so. So from this point on, we work with like sets of objects, sets of drivers, sets of trucks, and we continue like building the relaxed plan from this point on. So drivers get into a truck, keep on moving, and eventually the trucks move, and we reach all the reachable states. And these are the same states were reachable in the grounded case of FF. So to drive point home, here is a graph of like doing reachability analysis, both the grounded and the lifted case. So on the y-axis, we see the relative time difference doing the reachability analysis, grounded and lifted. So everything above the line, it means the lifted case is quicker, and everything below means the ground case is quicker. On the x-axis is the number of objects in a domain which eventually can be proven to be equivalent. And we can see that like if like very few objects can be made equivalent, like on the left side, the grounded case will win. Because in the worst case, if there's like no objects whatsoever which can be made equivalent, we basically fall back to the grounded case. But we do pay the overhead for the whole lifting data structure we introduce. And this is the case for rovers and storage, because they have like loads of like static constraints on the individual rovers, which means there's like no possibility to actually make them equivalent. So we pay the overhead, but we don't actually gain anything from it. In the extreme case, the left side will be grippers, obviously, where you basically make all the balls equivalent. But as you can see, like as the problem instances grow, and there's like more objects in the domain which can be made equivalent, the eventually reaches the lifted case wins. And this holds for Xeno, depots, satellites, blocks worlds, etc. And it's quite nice to see that, like in the international planning competitions, like the harder problems, we actually fare better on. Actually, can compute the reachability case quicker than the grounded case. So not only are we quicker, we also consume less memory, which is a nice result. But of course, we want to use this lifted relaxed planning graph to generate a heuristic, and make sure the heuristic information we get from it is still informative. Because one of the big problems with lifting is you lose a lot of information, which, although quicker, you need to do like more search to actually find your plan. Another case is once we blow up these problems and make them 10 times as big. So what we've done for the next graph is we've taken like the problems from the international planning competitions, basically regenerate them with like 10 times more objects, like any objects in there. And we can see that like in this case the lifted representation is like a lot quicker, and for like a lot of the problems like all the way to the top, the ground case just clears. Right, so having like a lifted RPG, we now look how do we extract a heuristic from it. And we're going to compare this to FF. So we've tried to like use the same strategies FF uses when extracting a lift plan, which means if we got like a no-op we can apply, we use no-op, and if there's like multiple achievers for like effect and relaxed planning graph, we basically use like a simple heuristic to determine which of the preconditions are easy to achieve and go with that action. So this will work, but will give you very poor heuristic guidance. And that's because the liftedness in it. And we'll see an example. So in this case, say we've got like a very simple problem, like a graph with like S1, S2, S3 connected and two drivers. The goal will be get like the drive from the left edge of the graph to the right side of the graph. So the lifted max plan will look like that, where you got drivers at drive 1 at S1, drive 2 at S2. We will drive 1 to location S2 and move like drive 2 to location S1 and S3. After doing this, drive 1 and drive 2 will be treated equivalently, which means on the right side in the second fact layer, you see we found driver 2 or driver 1 has reached location S3. We're done. Where are we? Because when we look at like the achiever for getting driver 1 to S3, we see it actually applies actually moving driver 2 from location S2 to location S3. So there's a discrepancy between the object we actually solve the problem for. So this next graph here would be to again drive 2 location S3, not again drive 1 to location S3. So we need to like make up for this this problem. We do this by adding an extra cost for substituting driver 1 for driver 2. And in this case, we simply take the effect layer at which like both objects become equivalent and add this heuristic information to the final heuristic information we compute, which in this case will be like 1 for the action and additional 1 for the substitution, which gives us in this case, luckily, like the optimal heuristic. But it's always the case, obviously. So to test like how good or bad this lifted heuristic is, we try this against like a set of problems from the IPC. We tested both the number of states we need to explore and also the length of the plan we find. And we compare this against FF. So the red line here would be like the number of states we visited with the lifted, and the green is the number of states FF visits for actually fast the plan. And surprisingly, we don't do too bad. FF is able to solve like one more problem than we are. But in general, like sometimes we visit like less states, sometimes we do a little bit more, but you know, it's pretty good like being like a lifted heuristic. For Boxwell, however, we basically beat like basically every single problem. And the same goes for like the plan length is like a lot less, usually like half than what FF actually computes. The reason being is that we found that the substitution we made between all different blocks actually makes up for like a lot of information we lose when just use the FF heuristic. And we actually get like heuristic information closer to the optimal heuristic than FF does. And this translates into like, you know, us having to visit like less states. The same holds for depots, because depots actually in itself holds as a subproblem the Boxwell domain. And you need to like stack the crates on pallets in different like depots and such. So here we see we visit like less states, and something we actually solve like one more problem FF does, although FF like solved problem number 9, I think, whereas we don't. The case for rovers is because there's like little benefit we get from lifting, because the constraints in the rover's domain makes sure we can't make many rovers equivalents. So for many cases we are very, very close to the FF heuristic, as you would expect. The only reason we don't solve like the bigger problems is because like the time cutoff, and because we actually use more time to actually compute heuristic, and that's basically because we use FF as like the main. That's basically like a subprogram in I. Sorry. So the problem actually here, the program we program, we actually use the FFX in the background. So we basically have to translate like the states from FFX into like our own representation and back again, which basically gives quite loads of like time. But as we like implement like a proper planner, we basically should be able to solve as many problems as FF does. To conclude, looking at the reachability analysis, we've shown that we can create like the same reachability as FF does by creating the same outputs, using like less memories, and depending on the problem domain, we are actually quicker than FF does. And we look at the heuristic we can generate from these lifted structures is we compare very favorably to FF. In some domains like very close to FF, and sometimes actually surpasses FF. which is like a surprising result, we think, because usually doing like lifted, very like lifted heuristics user performs worse because you've got less informative heuristics. And also we can actually apply these heuristics to bigger domains and hopefully in the future solve bigger problems. That's it, thank you.